Today's session is part of a new insight series from TopSource focused on critical but under-discussed drivers of PE value creation, the global workforce. Because while globalization is often a central tenet of the growth thesis, turning that ambition into value depends on a lot more than just a solid plan. It requires flawless execution on the ground. Today, I'm joined by three leaders who have deep experience in all of these angles of challenge as investors, as operators, and as strategic advisors to PE-backed businesses. They've seen what accelerates growth and what silently erodes it. Allow me to introduce them to you now. First, we're going to introduce Ian Larkin, CEO of TopSource. Ian brings experience in leadership of a number of private equity-backed businesses. Not only has he built and scaled companies globally, but as the CEO of TopSource, he's helped nearly 200 other PE-backed firms do the same, giving him a deep understanding of the dimensional and operational complexity that sits beneath the surface when companies try to expand and integrate across borders. Second, let me introduce Martin Smith. Martin is chairman and board advisor for multiple PE-backed firms. He's seen global expansion play out from the executive suite and understands how to lead management teams through the challenges of culture, compliance, and integration post-acquisition. Finally, Tom Maisels. Tom is a partner at Horizon Capital, a leading mid-market private equity firm. He's worked across dozens of deals and is known for his expertise in driving international scale as part of the value creation strategy, while avoiding the execution traps that often come with it. First question we're going to talk about, it goes to Tom. Tom, let's start from the top. There's been a lot of commentary in the recent times about reshoring, about tariffs, and about trade barriers. Why does globalization still matter to PE today, and how is it evolving in the current geopolitical climate?
Hi, Jeff, and thank you for having me. So I'll take that question in a couple of parts to unpack it. Why does globalization matter still? From an investor perspective, we look at new investments primarily through the lens of TAM, which is total addressable market. And we're really thinking, how large is the TAM and how much headroom for growth is within that TAM? Not just now, but in 5 years and 10 years beyond. And as part of that consideration, one assessment would be to consider expanding that total addressable market outside of the company's core jurisdictions today to go international, into a jurisdiction where the business can serve new customers with the same products and services. So that's a real strategic consideration, thinking about how to take a business, from our perspective, will be UK headquartered, but with the capability to go international strategically. And that needs to be really carefully considered. What's the ability for that business to serve that customers outside of our core territory? Do we already have existing customers there, which can be a natural step into a market? We just want to double down. Do we have existing partners there that can support us entering into that market? Once you've reached that conclusion that there remains a strong opportunity to expand into a given territory outside of the core jurisdiction, then one needs to really consider the feasibility of that and how it can be executed tactically. And therein, you must deeply consider the operational risks, the cultural risks, the HR risks. I'm sure we can talk about that later on. My first point would be global expansion matters because it can open up new growth opportunities for private equity investors. And to your second point on a very fluid, changing, and ultimately uncertain global landscape, clearly adds another lens of complexity, which must be considered within both the strategic as well as the operational considerations. Now, I think the first thing to mention is, from a Horizon perspective, we're investing in businesses that are predominantly providing services and technology, and often a blend of the two. So the transfer of physical goods, which is clearly more impacted by the current issue du jour
Right.
on tariff is less significant, clearly, but it must be carefully considered. And I think the final thing to consider when we're thinking about a new investment, obviously there's the market opportunity and how do you execute it, but also there's the access to talent. And that won't necessarily just be about a labor arbitrage play. It's about getting access to the best talent available to support on a strategy to grow sustainably. And that may and quite often will require looking outside of the core jurisdiction to find that talent to support on the growth plans. And whilst that's can be a really strategic imperative for a company, it needs to be done well. Each jurisdiction will have their local complexities, whether it's compliance, whether it's employee regulation, contracting. And so ensuring that's done appropriately with the right care, process, and diligence is really critical to make sure that you don't become unstuck later down.
Makes total sense. Thanks, Tom. Ian, how do you see this from a portfolio company point of view?
I would see this as the world is getting more challenging and the demands of management teams are rising at the same time. So from the client's perspective, this is getting tougher and more important to get right. On the sort of geopolitical trends and all the rest, what we're finding is after probably a couple of decades of a trend of greater sort of alignment and consistency, countries are going the opposite directions. And legislation, regulations are going kind of against the direction of foreign ownership, immigration visas, labor leasing, the kind of things we get involved in, and our clients have to find a way through. Also, national governments, in the sense of trying to balance their budgets, are being much more, I'd say, interventionist. More inquiries being raised, more challenges being raised on whether foreign companies have deemed establishment, should be paying more taxes, things like that. So that's all sort of making things harder. But the other thing for my clients and sort of PE-owned firms is higher cost of capital, and investor expectations are for these management teams to move forward, grow, increase EBITDA faster than they ever used to. So that combination, I think, is net where this is all heading.
Thank you, Ian. The second part of our discussion today is going to be about how workforce strategy, structure, and compliance has a bearing on this success. Martin, when you're chairing a business, you identified new target markets, yet they're not familiar with the operating systems of these markets. What are some of the common workforce-related mistakes or blind spots that you've seen?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I think there's 2 or 3 ways to think about that. First, for me, is around culture, and what sits at the heart of culture. It's people and it's communication. So when going into a new territory, communication is key, and the cultural impact of working overseas in not just a different regulatory environment, but in a different cultural environment is really important to get right. I think the other part for me is, and again, Ian will recognize this, that the most important and the most precious resource is management time, executive time. By the very nature, moving into a new territory, it's going to be a relatively small proportion of company revenue for a period of time until that can accelerate and the addressable market can really be mined. So there is a huge danger where companies spend 80 to 90% of their exec time on a market that, to start with, is possibly 5 to 10 to 15% of their revenue or EBITDA. So just getting that balance, I think, is really key, and something that we talk around a lot at various board meetings that I sit on. I think the other part, when thinking about global expansion, is protection of IP. What's going to be valuable for a business as we're driving value, and maintaining ownership of IP, I think, is really key, and therefore actually possibly less use of contractors and more use of employed, be it through an EOR model or a direct employment model, for me, is really key and something I constantly come back to with my management teams.
Wholeheartedly agree. Thanks, Martin. Ian, Tom, anything you'd like to layer on that?
Yeah, I would just want to say what I find with client organizations is in that management team, and this is to Martin's point, you might have some experience of second, third, fourth markets. A chief exec might have worked there before, whatever it might be. But it is just way less experience and wisdom and all the rest than the management team had in their home market. So the kind of transformational move is being done at a point where collective experience is low. So that quickly then flips to how does a team find the necessary expertise? And that then is ultimately the more important thing to get right. Finding people who've got the expertise in employment, in legal, in taxation, and in company secretarial matters in that new market. And ultimately the management team's big call is getting those right people into the camp rather than feeling like within 6 months they can go from a position of relative newness to a market to being as wise on that place as they were in their home territory.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I think to Ian's point, it's critical to get the operational execution, because then you can focus, the team can focus on actually executing on the commercial strategy of moving into that market. Because if you get the operational wrong, you're almost undoubtedly going to fail on the commercial side as well. So you've got to do the hard yards in ensuring that when you're entering a territory, the compliance and the operational execution is done exceptionally well, because that provides the foundation to then strategically execute on the commercial side. And then then there would just be the consideration on whether that's being done organically and inorganically, because both come with different execution risks as well as, I guess, models on how to do it.
I think the final point, I guess, for me also would be just thinking about, we talked about different regulatory environments, but thinking about how there are different employment law practices in different employment law processes in every country, every territory, even state level, clearly in the US. So working with people and working with a partner that truly understands that, for me, has been vital when I've been looking at globalizing various businesses.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. When you deal with culture, you're dealing with people, you have to understand the employment culture that you're dealing with. Otherwise, building on sand, So
yeah, let me just add one thing is sometimes the way of making it happen is a management team would go super tactical and they do a quick hire locally, or it doesn't feel like as big but problems come up when you're trying to let somebody go and you're trying to so you've got to get things right from the start in the context of your medium-term ambition. And the peril of tactical is first 6 months went better than you thought, but it's month 6, 12, 18, you're starting to have to unwind some of the consequences. So yeah, I agree with everything being said here. You do need to really get up the learning curve in terms of wisdom, typically better done by finding people who are experts in that market. And then over a year, 2, 3, you start to ingrain that in your own team and your confidence grows.
Understood. Gentlemen, anything else? So part 3, we're going to move into the next phase of the business, which is where acquisition, integration efforts often fall short and how you get it right. So the question is, why do so many post-acquisition integrations fall short? And what does it take to get them right? Ian, let's start with you.
Thanks, Jeff. So there's a general topic of acquisitions and integration, but I think when it comes to using it as a means toward international expansion, what layers on to all of the norms here? And I think the context that I would typically see is my client is buying a firm in a market that they don't know particularly well. The firm will be an unlisted company. So levels of transparency, of data quality, of all of these sorts of things is going to be somewhat limited. And they'll be doing it with either advisors who are from the home market. So even though they mightn't let on, they've got an equivalent learning curve, or advisors who are based in this target market, in which case the advisors typically aren't particularly well known to the management team. So these are all pretty substantial additions to getting it right when it comes to acquiring businesses in any case. But I will finish by saying, we have seen this be a fantastic kind of springboard for clients as well. When you do get it right, it lets you achieve in a matter of months 0 to 12 what would otherwise take 3 to 5 years. I would just say there's quite a lot of watch outs here, but it's proven to be a very successful path for a lot of firms too.
Martin, anything to add to that?
No, I think having the right advisors by your side is really key. I think we've already said on this video, it's addressing the global market. It really increases the addressable market that you can look for, but it comes with its challenges. It comes with the challenges of localization, localized the employment law. It comes with the challenges of culture, and actually having someone on your side sitting with you, almost sort of holding your hand through some of these challenges, I think is the best advice I could give any organization looking to expand globally. And I think ideally, ideally a global provider who has local knowledge at many points of local knowledge, for me, would be the ideal partner to partner with. And I think that's something that, looking at TopSource in particular, that's what they offer. And therefore, the right partner at the right time, giving you the right advice, and not just access to a library of content that you have to interpret yourself. I think it's that really tailored advice when you need it is absolutely vital.
Especially when you're coming into an acquisition integration conversation, because if you're building with the end in mind and you have the right partner that you're aligned with, then the acquisition of the integration is just more seamless.
Sorry, Jeff, quickly, because it's on my mind, is we do tend in diligence to focus on the commercial matters, all of that side of things. But what I would observe is what can really trip buyers up is the diligence all went as intended, the plans were all set. And then what do you know? You're a few months in and you start to realize you have problems that weren't unearthed around misclassified contractors, around employment contracts with terms that are not going to be applicable when you look to exit people. It can even be things like the leases on the buildings. All this kind of practical, corporate, administrative matter doesn't tend to rate as high on the diligence priorities, but can set a management team back 6, 12, 18 months. And this was not at all expected when they're laying their initial plans. So it's those sorts of practical nitty-gritty type things that I think the local experience and focus, as Martin described, is really going to catch before it becomes a problem, can be factored into the price, the plans, everything else pre-ac.
Yeah, and I'd just add to that there's all that kind of practical administrative pitfalls that can often be forgotten about. But a point that Martin touched on was the cultural element to it as well. Really not underestimating, even if you speak the same language, that there will be cultural nuances, that if the deal is being done predominantly virtually by nature of not being in your core territory, you're not going to be spending as much time together. And having a partner that can help you really think about all of those specific administrative compliance elements, as well as the softer side, is really important, because the softer side also can be a pitfall if you may be speaking the same language, but talking at cross purposes can mean that things that were considered agreed pre-deal were actually not agreed post-deal. And that's something that can't necessarily be box ticked in a due diligence checklist, but is something that should be on the management team's minds as they're going through that process.
Yeah, agreed. Cultural alignments and making sure that transition is done properly, it's messaged properly, really affects the integration of the acquisition. We're going to move forward into my next question would be, what does best in class support look like when you're scaling teams globally? All right. A lot of organizations talk about support, but what does it really look like and feel like? So let's Start with Ian.
I would say a couple of things on this. So the continuous point is you need the learned experience. You don't want any kind of missteps. You want to get things right from the get-go. Just like a really specific example, we had a client a couple of weeks ago, wanted to move a key executive and their family to Switzerland. And as we're listening to them, one of my team has worked in a consulate in Switzerland is saying, look, no problem with that person getting a visa, but the family won't be able to come for another 6 months. Boom. For them personally, that wasn't going to work. They were able to adjust plans, and that saves them kind of 6 months of angst and all the rest. So that learned experience. The other point is when you think about what sort of range of third-party involvement is required, you're into lawyers, accountants, you've got banks, the list goes on. And it very quickly can become a massive time sink for a CFO, CPO, however the firm's organized in a market. Like Martin said earlier, that might be accounting for 5, 10, 15% in best case scenario in the first couple of years. And having to travel to these places to meet these people, even all of this. So the best way through all of that, I think, and this is what TopSource does, is find one partner who will handle all of that for you. So we have the expertise in-house in most cases, but where we don't, we've got a black book of known and trusted advisors who can do each of these little pieces, but we look after that. And for the client, we're like the one go-to or the single point of contact, the one throat to choke, whatever it might be. And that dramatically reduces the amount of time, the amount of anxiety for the senior execs in the client firm. So that combination of lived experience, of singularity, of coverage, I think is the best this can be.
I think, as we said already, management time is a premium and a really scarce resource. So for me, best in class looks one umbrella organization such as TopSource and one point of contact. Therefore, actually the path of least resistance. So you don't want any friction between the advice we give and the management team we're supporting, or the advice that TopSource give and the management team that they're supporting. I think as well, it's a personal piece, and maybe it's building on what Ian said about that learnt experience, but it is not access to a tech platform with content that you can read. It is access to people who are supporting the decisions and speeding the process up for the exec team, and that being supported by some technology that makes it easier to onboard, in new employees in a country where the exec team don't necessarily have the experience before. So it's very tailored. It's a single point of contact, and there's very little friction, very little resistance in terms of time sync, and it's just really efficient and really straightforward to deliver.
All right. So fantastic session, gentlemen. Much appreciated. I appreciate your candor, your insight, and the conversation. A couple of quick takeaways would be that global expansion still matters. Getting it right on the ground, how you operationalize it is of a critical importance. Getting the workforce strategy right is also critical from a cultural and compliance perspective. And also acquisition integration is obviously harder than it looks, both from a tactical perspective as well as a softer kind of cultural integration perspective. Anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, just one thing from me, Jeff. I think I'm really keen and really focused on the management teams that I work with, focusing and driving value. That's what global expansion delivers to businesses that I chair. And that means actually not wasting and not burning time on things that actually a partner like TopSource can deliver. And that's peace of mind around compliance, peace of mind around employment law, peace of mind around the right benefits and the right practices. So management teams focusing on value, a partner like TopSource focusing on making sure the management teams and the company is ultimately compliant.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thanks again, gentlemen. I look forward to the next chapter of our series. Have a fantastic day.
Great.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.